Welcome at Food for Thought. Today, the subject is science versus scientism. And my guest speaker is Gilad, who is a physicist. So, what is science and what is scientism that we hear a lot about? Elaborate, please.
All right. So I really think that recently we see a lot of talk about science and stuff like you should follow the science and people blaming each other for not being true enough to the science and things like that. And I think a lot of that is equivocation and using those terms in the wrong way and sometimes misunderstanding what science is, what science isn't, and what is this thing called scientism that we hear about, and also the relation to that to what is the scientific method. So I think we can start by what is the least contentious and most clear, which is what is the scientific method. So the way you can think about the scientific method is, let's say you have some sort of problem or some observation, some phenomenon that you want to understand. So you have this phenomenon. The scientific method says, once you have that, let's say you have a tennis ball and a feather, and you drop them, and the tennis ball falls faster than the feather. All right, that's your observation. Then you make a hypothesis. Why does the tennis ball fall faster than the feather? Maybe it's because it's yellow and the feather is white, right? That's some hypothesis. Then you come up with an experiment that would either affirm or refute that hypothesis. And a good experiment is not the experiment that gives you the result you wanted. Rather, it's an experiment that affirms or refutes. So a bad experiment would be one that you run and then you don't know anything new about it. And that's very important to start from, right? So if you have an image of someone saying, oh, the experiment failed, and let's say people think about it, about people in lab coats doing that, and that's a kind of misconception, because an experiment that has failed is just one that hasn't taught you anything new. It's not one that didn't get you the result you wanted, right? So this is the scientific method, let's say, in a nutshell. You can talk a bit more about that, but I think it's sufficient to kind of understand how these things work and how essential they are to science.
Yeah. So basically, you have to learn something from the experiment you conducted. You have to get results one way or the other.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the part that is pointed out by many interesting people, for one of them is Robert M. Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is that this part of making a hypothesis, like you can make any hypothesis and there's no algorithm that says, oh, this is a good hypothesis and this is a bad hypothesis. And the way we make hypotheses about these things is not so transparent to us. There's something philosophically that might be driving us, but that's a different point. It's just an interesting one to kind of keep in mind as we go along. In any case, this is the method, and the important part of this method is that experiment is the ultimate decider of how things actually work. You could have a theory, but you have to have an experiment that has shown that your theory was affirmed or refuted.
Exactly.
Now the thing that I think is most confused about science is people think, science is those things that follow the scientific method, right? That's simple. It's called the same, right? The scientific method is what science does. And that's actually not accurate and can be very misleading. So to understand what science is, I think it's best to start from the scientific revolution and to understand what it comes in opposition to. So when I talk about the scientific revolution, we're talking about from mid-late 1500s to the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s, pretty much from Copernicus to Newton, with Galileo in the middle there. Now, I am relying on a source where Paolo Rossi talks about Bacon's conception of science, which we'll link below. It's not free access, unfortunately, but it's a really interesting text. So, what does science come in opposition to? What came before science, and how is it different from what came before it? One of the main points is that science comes in opposition to alchemy and magic. Now, it's important to understand that alchemists knew a lot about the world. They had a lot of knowledge about how to do things. And the practices that they had to discover this knowledge weren't so different from the scientific method, though they weren't exactly the same, but it's not like this, it was a leap in that regard of the method. What was different in alchemy is the access to knowledge was dependent on your status. So you would have to be initiated into the higher ranks in order to learn the secrets of this knowledge. This also means that the people that had the knowledge couldn't codify their knowledge. They couldn't write it in a way that would be publicly available. It had to be wrapped in mysteries. It had to be something that a person had to work really hard to learn. This is also the same when you think about magic. It's very different from how we think about it today, but the thing that is similar is the magician can do things, but they will never tell you their secret. The point is to keep the knowledge secret. And science comes in opposition to that, saying, no, science needs to be democratic. It should be publicly available, all of the knowledge, and the experiments should be reproducible and replicatable. So when we have so many people that are able to test these hypotheses and these ideas, we would get closer to truth in that way, rather than by hiding the truth and keeping it only to the initiated.
Yeah, it feels like the initiated alchemists, they used the knowledge of science which they discovered, and then they passed on to the initiated students, and it was used for power and status somehow.
Well, I'm not sure. It's still to some degree used to that end, but there are a lot of other problems with that. I think also it's important to note that we take this for granted today. We say, sure, science is public, but this is really, really an odd idea, and it really has to presuppose the goodness of knowledge, because we know that knowledge is not only good in itself, it also gives people power. And this power is now available to everyone, including the people you may disagree with, right? So now, instead of being locked away within the group of people that are your people, in this case, the Catholic Church, knowledge is now publicly available, right? That is very, very different in the way of thinking about what, how, I don't want to say power, what kind of positive influence, let's say, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake has, that you would be willing to take that leap of faith, so to speak, that you would be willing to share it so widely and allow so many people access to that. An additional thing, just to close the point about science in opposition to alchemy, is that in alchemy, the authority of what you say is dependent on your status. So the point is, if you're in a high position, then you are initiated to the greater secrets, thus you must be more knowledgeable and what you say must be true. Whereas science says the authority is within the claims, right? If you have a stronger claim to truth, then that is the authority. And this is also culturally why we think of scientists as plainly dressed, right? They don't have this idea that, oh, the greatest scientist must be dressed in the finest suit and presented with the highest honors, right? The fact that scientists are dressed casually is actually a remnant of that cultural perception that came in opposition to alchemy.
Yeah, so I do remember alchemists being dressed in all wizard-like clothes. I don't know if it's historically accurate, but it's how they were portrayed. Scientists, they are like I mean, they dressed really, really modestly. It's as a token, I think, to the knowledge itself, rather the facade of knowledge. Science should not be the show. But the status thing, though, like who is the biggest expert in science? Let's say in a field, the scientist who published most, who discovered most, or the scientist who is like, I'm the student of that prominent scientist, but himself did not discover or publish any, did not contribute to the pool of knowledge.
Well, I think what you're raising is an important question that is also interesting for me about in what ways has science changed and diverged from the times of the scientific revolution, right? In what ways maybe status now plays a bigger role than it should, or things like that. And I think that's an interesting question to think about. I think the main place where it's expressed is in the relation between the people outside of science to the people within science. So what was supposed to be public knowledge is now actually very much outside of the access of people to really read the scientific articles. Until recently, it was really a financial barrier. So scientific journals would require huge amounts of money to allow you to just read the latest publications. Now that's changing a bit, but there's still a problem that there's a lot of barriers for anyone outside of science to really engage with the science itself. Usually you would engage with some person who would make the science publicly available. So you would read it on the newspaper after someone made their opinion about what actually was discovered, or you would read it online or on Twitter or wherever.
Simplified for a regular reader, let's
Yeah.
say.
And it's a question like how much of that is necessary. And I'm sure some of it is, because there's a lot of really complicated things, but also how much of that is kind of purposeful obfuscation, with people making use of redundant jargon in order to kind of block out their specialization from people outside to be able to make whatever claims about that.
Yeah.
So that was one claim, right? One opposition that science had, or one cultural trend that science came in opposition to. The second thing that it came in opposition to, which is something less discussed, is it also comes in opposition to the empirics. And the empirics are basically this notion that all you have is experiments. And that sounds like very scientific if you only think about the scientific method, right? You think if experiments are the basic claim to truth, then why do you have all these crazy theories? Just, give me the experiments, that's the data, and that's it. And it's a more interesting, I don't know if more, but it's a very interesting opposition, because when you think about the problem of causation and correlation, or the fact that correlation doesn't equal causation, how do you get around that? So you make an experiment and you see that some variable is correlated with another variable. How do you actually know that the change in this variable caused the change in the other variable? That's a really, really hard problem. And the way that science deals with that, which is in contrast with empirics, is science proposes a mechanism. How does this affect this? And by offering this mechanism, there will be a lot of other predictions. Like, if this is the mechanism, it should also mean that this would happen and that would happen. And then you can do experiments on all of those. Once you have this distributed network of things that different people are going to test for different reasons, and a lot of them are being affirmed, so this mechanism makes sense in a lot of ways, that's how you really reduce the chance that what you saw was just some unrelated correlation. It is important to notice what kind of thinking goes into that, right? So you offer that mechanism, and you have to think about the intuitions that mechanism brings and what it would sort of imply. Even if the original person that offered that mechanism didn't have this in mind, you would make these kinds of claims. And these are actually claims of plausibility in many cases, rather than complete refutations. It's just interesting to kind of consider.
It's like the tree that grows and expands. And the direction it grows, it depends on the each new discovered truth. So the way the road the branch takes, let's say, it's here is the truth, and then it can build up on it.
Yeah, that's a really, I like that visual metaphor for that.
Tree of science. Yeah.
Now, the third point is how science comes in opposition to the Aristotelian framework. And that's, I think, mostly captured by Newton's famous quote of hypotheses non-fingo, or I don't make hypotheses. Now, for someone who's not familiar, that sounds crazy, right? We just talked about the fact that science is about making hypotheses. So what is Newton talking about? Basically, when he published his Principia, the sum of his work about, like, it's Principia Mathematica, it's a lot of what Newton's most famous work is about. And he was put on the spot by many scholars who are saying, okay, you've described what inertia is, you've described what gravity is, but why is gravity and why is inertia? And that's where he responded, saying, I don't make these hypotheses, which in the general scheme, it means science is no longer about making hypotheses. So the existential why questions are now outside of science. In the Aristotelian framework, why do things fall? Because everything wants to be in their natural place, and the earth is at the center, and the center of the earth is where everything wants to go. That's an existentialist why. Science, from the scientific revolution onward, has decided that this is no longer within the realm of science. This now can be left to philosophy or any other field, but no longer within science.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like, I don't make hypotheses, but in a way, he follows the discoveries and raises the questions.
Yeah, but again, the important point is, where does he follow the discoveries? He's no longer following them where they lead him to the existential questions. There's no longer this analogy that says, oh, just like gravity is pulling the tennis ball to the earth, so are we as people somehow, by analogy, the same. Which is,
I mean, I understand. So science diverged from philosophy, took a different road, and it became its own thing here.
not exactly. Science is absolutely subordinate to philosophy.
Oh,
Right? You can't do science, and John Vervaeke talks about this. If you don't think that experiments are the right way to gain knowledge about reality, there is no experiment that can convince you otherwise.
oh yeah.
So there's a philosophical foundation that is necessary for science, but it doesn't go the other way around in a way. Science can only inform philosophy by inspiration. This is
Oh, so it's like one dependent on the other. So the discoveries in science can inform philosophy as well.
well, they can't inform it, but they can inspire it. That's what I'm trying to get at, right? So
Ah, I think I'm narrowing on to that understanding. I'm not yet there though. Like that's why it's food for thought.
so you probably know this this famous quote. I think it's attributed to Hume. I'm not sure what was exactly his way of saying it, but you can't derive an ought from an is, right? You can't derive what should be from what is. And that's kind of a way to specify this fundamental separation. So if you're asking, let's take it like a question that is usually an existential. You're asking, why is there evil in the world? Can science answer that? It depends what why you mean. So can science make a claim about what fundamental patterns are beneath what we see as evil? It might be able to. But if you find these fundamental patterns and you ask yourself, okay, but why isn't the world different? Right? Why existentially is there even evil? Why are these patterns even there? That's outside of science, right? You can tell what is, but you can't tell what ought to be.
Okay, so science tells what is, and what ought to be is to be discovered.
Outside of science.
Outside of science. Outside of science.
Yeah.
I understand. Yeah, I think I'm getting there. Thank you for explaining that.
Sure. So a few more things that are important, I think, before we get to how these are misused and what scientism is. Science is not technology. And the goal of science is not to make our lives more comfortable, convenient. Science is about pursuing truth, finding out what is. That's the goal of science. And like I said, it's based on the fundamental assumption that that's a good thing to do, finding out what is. And that's why if we look at all we've talked about, people think that making some technological development is a scientific achievement, but you can't even publish a new technology if it's patented in a scientific journal, right? Because you would have to hide how you did that. And that's exactly what science goes against, right? In the scientific revolution. Science is about that knowledge which is public. If
Transparent. I
yeah,
get it.
exactly.
Because it's like saying clearly what is. And the new technology is like, oh, we will give you the final product, and what is you have to, like, it does matter.
Yeah, we might know something that you don't, but we're not going to tell you because then we won't be able to make money off of it. And I'm not saying the technology is bad. I'm saying that it's simply something that builds on science, but is not a part of science.
Kind of see parallels with alchemists now. But not in the scientist part, but people who develop new technologies, they go the road that alchemists took. Only the initiated will know who signed all the non-disclosure agreements and will not pass the knowledge to the unauthorized parties. I get it. Interesting.
Yeah, I think there is something in that, but also, right, there's the point that I think both alchemy and science were similar in the fact that they didn't reduce knowledge to power, right? So in that sense, a person who brings you a new technology is about how powerful this new technology is. It's not necessarily about, look, we've made new knowledge.
I mean, they improve the new technology, so they keep working on it, yet within initiated circles somehow.
Yeah. So I think the last thing to mention is scientism, and in that context also like pseudoscience, things that people call science which are not. So one thing to I like 2 points first of all about what people think that we can call scientism and why it's wrong. So this notion that science will solve the mystery of our existence, it can't. It's constructed in the way that it can't. That's a part of why science is science rather than a branch of religion like it was in the past. So this idea that science would somehow elevate the human spirit and solve this why are we here questions is a misconception of what science is and especially of what it isn't. And this is what one of the ways that you can kind of classify scientism, right? This pseudo-religious obsession with science. And another another way to identify scientism is this notion that science will provide us like this power of the gods, right? We will be as gods by the amount of power we will get from science, like the ideas of uploading your brain into a simulation and all of those kinds of things. And it's important to note here, that's not even what science is aimed at, right? Science is not about providing us power. It's about getting to the truth. It's about
What
understanding
is?
what is, exactly.
It's, just to diverge a little bit from that, and in order to move forward for a person within this subjective one life, the person has to understand what is actually happening, to assess life circumstances, to identify what is, and based on that, the person can move forward. And I can see parallels in science. So science is actually that understanding of reality to that point in reality, so that people can move forward the aim is not the goal, the aim is understanding.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, right? Science is that part which comes in somewhat subordinate fashion to what you want to do. So if you have a goal and you need to understand what is in the way of your goal, science can really help there. But if you want to know what the goal should be, then science can't really help you.
Yeah, that's really clear. Thank you. That's actually really helpful. People have a lot of misconceptions about the science, and they mix the direction with actual aim. Cool.
Yeah. So I hope that was helpful and interesting. And yeah, I think we can sum it up here. So I think to kind of get a feel for science and how science was perceived much closer to the scientific revolution, there's a paper that Paolo Rossi made about Francis Bacon, and his idea of science. And I can read a few quotes from there, and it can kind of help clarify what the mindset is. And we'll also link the paper. It's unfortunately not free access, but if you happen to have access, you could see where the source is from. So what is important is to open a middle way between experience and theorizing, and in this way rescue the human mind from the obscurity of tradition, the giddy whirl of arguments, the waves and roundabout ways of experience.
Beautiful.
There's another quote where he was talking about the problematic issue with alchemy. He says about the alchemist. He says, his overlarge and overardent hopes go hand in hand with a continual state of self-accusation, for he ends by blaming himself for the errors into which he is led by the texts held to be infallible. So this is also how science comes in opposition to just following tradition. And I think the last quote I want to make regarding what the goal of science is when Bacon says, works themselves are of greater value as pledges of truth than as contributing to the comforts of life.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Gilad. People, check out all the links below, and I will see you in next Food for Thought. Bye.
Bye.